It is a curious weakness of the English mind, otherwise so admirable in its preference for compromise, that it will tolerate any quantity of bad architecture provided it is called historic, and any quantity of worse behavior provided it is called none of our affair. Thus, on a raw afternoon in late October, Lord Peter Wimsey found himself motoring at a speed which would have distressed the more earnest of the county councillors, along a lane that appeared to have been designed by a drunken hedgehog and executed by a committee of nettles. The country about was of that damp, well-bred kind which looks as though it had been washed, combed, and put away in lavender. The fields did not so much lie as reclined in a posture of resigned respectability, and the trees held up their last leaves with the air of persons clinging to an invitation they could not quite honor, and the sky, flat, colorless, and insinuating, suggested that if one were to knock upon it, it would answer in the voice of a butler. "No, my lord, not at home." Bunter, in the passenger seat, regarded the road with a tranquil disapproval. "If I might make so bold, my lord," he observed, "the near side wheel appears to be taking an undue interest in the ditch." Peter, whose driving was always either an act of affectionate daring toward machinery or a moral exercise inflicted upon it, laughed softly. "Quite right, Bunter. The wheel has a romantic nature. It thinks ditches are cloisters and wishes to retire from the world." "To retire," said Bunter, "is one thing, my lord. To be flung in is another." Peter eased the car delicately back into the middle of the lane, as though coaxing a neurotic duchess off a footstool. "You know," he said, "I begin to suspect that the Church's influence in these parts persists chiefly in the arrangement of hedges. Everything keeps making for penance." Bunter made no reply. He never did when his lordship was punning about salvation. It was not that he disapproved of puns. It was that he suspected them of encouraging familiarity with the Almighty. They were bound for St. Thaddeus Priory, a comparatively modern reinvention of something much older, an Anglican priory in name and sentiment, formed in the last century by persons who desired medievalism without the inconvenience of actual monks. The place belonged now to the Harcourt family, whose money had been acquired, such as money in England often is, by an ancestor doing something dubious in India, and an heir doing something pious in Surrey. The present owner, Sir Alaric Harcourt, was a man of cultivated tastes and a conscience so refined that it could detect sin in the sugar bowl. Peter had been invited, or more precisely, summoned, by a letter bearing a crest and an agitation that seeped through even the most respectful phrasing. "My dear Lord Peter, forgive my presumption in writing to you. I find myself in a position so singular, so grotesque, that I can scarcely bring myself to set it down. There has been an incident at St. Thaddeus which the police, with their regrettable appetite for the obvious, are already misconstruing. I beg you, in the name of common decency, to come. I will not say more in writing. Yours in some distress, Alaric Harcourt." Peter had read it twice, once with amusement, and once with that small tightening at the corner of the mind which meant, here is a man frightened not by what has happened, but by what it implies. The word grotesque was the bait. Sir Alaric did not use it lightly. A bend in the lane revealed the Priory at last, crouched behind its walls like a self-conscious secret. It had the faintly theatrical look of a building that had been told to be ancient and had done its best. One wing was genuinely old. Grey stone, narrow windows, a squat tower that might once have been watchful for border raiders or merely for poor people. The rest had been appended in periods of enthusiastic taste. A neo-Gothic cloister, built, Peter suspected, by a man who had read the mysteries of Udolpho and wished to live inside it, and a Georgian domestic block that tried to pretend it wasn't there, and, most conspicuous, a Victorian chapel with stained glass so earnest it could have preached without clergy. The gates were open. This, Peter noted, was either hospitality or the kind of negligence that invites catastrophe. He parked in a gravel sweep where the stones crunched with the guilty sound of breaking small bones. Somewhere a bell was tolling, once, twice, and then stopping, as though the bell itself had lost confidence in the propriety of making a noise. A woman came quickly down the steps to meet them. She was in her early 30s, thin without being fragile, and dressed in black so uncompromisingly that one might have thought she had quarreled with color on principle. Her face had the pallor of one who sleeps badly and the eyes of one who thinks too much. "Ah, Lord Peter? Thank God, I mean—" She checked herself, as if even gratitude were indecorous in a tragedy. "I am Mrs. Eleanor Harcourt." Peter kissed her hand with that elaborate gentleness which made women forgive him for being clever. "My dear Mrs. Harcourt, don't thank God until you know what I'm going to say. He may not approve of my conclusions." Her mouth twitched unwillingly. "You have that reputation." "So I'm told. Where is Sir Alaric?" "In the library, with Inspector Parker." Peter's eyebrows lifted. "Not Charles, I hope." "I believe his first name is Charles." Peter sighed in the manner of a man confronted by fate in the guise of family. "Oh, Lord. The police have brought in my brother-in-law. That's either a sign of providence or a plot to make sure I can never be impartial." Mrs. Harcourt glanced at Bunter, as though wondering if servants were allowed to witness this kind of flippancy. "I suppose," she said, "that humor is your way of keeping it at bay." "Oh, no. It's my way of examining it. Shall we go in?" They entered by a passage which was half corridor and half apology. The air was cold, carrying that particular smell of old stone and damp wood which is not unpleasant until one associates it with tombs. Somewhere in the building, a clock ticked with aggressive clarity, like a person insisting on being believed. As they walked, Peter's attention roamed, light as a cat and just as predatory. He noticed the pattern of the tiles in the passage, black and cream, laid in a checker that seemed too exact to be accidental. A curtain drawn across a small arched window, though the day was grey enough to offer no prying light, and a faint line of powdery grit along the skirting board, as though something had been dragged, or something had crumbled, or someone had been careless with a very specific kind of dirt. In the library, the fire was lit, but gave no warmth. It merely glowed, theatrical as the Priory itself. Books lined the walls in ranks that suggested both scholarship and the desire to look like it. At the center stood Sir Alaric, tall, white-haired, and arranged as carefully as the room, an ascetic gentleman who had mistaken self-control for virtue and was now discovering its limits. Beside him was a familiar figure, Inspector Charles Parker, solid, brisk, and faintly harassed by the knowledge that his wife's brother was about to interfere with his case. "Peter," said Parker, with the expression of a man greeting a hurricane with an umbrella. "No, you're here." "My dear Charles," Peter replied, "I came as fast as the hedgehogs would permit." Parker's eyes flicked to Bunter, who was already silently placing Peter's hat and coat with the kind of reverence usually reserved for relics. "You were sent for," Parker said to Peter, as if establishing a legal point. "I was lured," said Peter, "by the word grotesque. One doesn't resist that. It's like hearing a violin out of tune. You must find the source." Sir Alaric stepped forward, his hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles shone. "I thank you for coming, Lord Peter. I can scarcely—" His voice faltered. "I cannot trust the obvious." "Not here." Parker, who had been taught by experience that aristocrats and obviousness are natural enemies, cleared his throat. "We're treating it as murder," he said, "until proven otherwise." "Murder?" repeated Mrs. Harcourt softly, as though tasting a word she did not wish to swallow. Peter turned to Sir Alaric. "Tell me," he said, "what has happened? But do it as though you were describing a game of chess. I'm not interested yet in your feelings, only in the moves." Sir Alaric's eyes, grey and fever-bright, fixed on a point above Peter's shoulder, as if he could not bear to look at any living thing while speaking. "This morning," he began, "at 10 minutes past 7, the chapel bell rang once. Only once, which is not its custom. At 7:30, Mrs. Dobson?" He nodded toward the door, where a blurred presence hovered and withdrew. "Our housekeeper found the chapel unlocked. The verger was not yet come. She entered." He paused. "And in the center of the chapel," he said, "and on the black and white pavement before the altar rail, she found Dr. Gideon Vale." Parker supplied the brisk police detail. "Vale was a visitor here, antiquarian, lecturer, doing work on the Priory's medieval remains." Peter murmured, "Ah, a man who reads the dead for a living?" Sir Alaric continued, voice tightening. He was lying on his back, his arms were extended, his fingers arranged. Sir Alaric swallowed. And around him, someone had set objects. Small objects, in a pattern. Peter looked at Parker. "A pattern?" Parker's mouth thinned. Like a diagram. Looked planned. Sir Alaric's face twitched with disgust. "A figure," he said. "A kind of geometry. Symmetrical. Deliberate. And on his chest." His voice dropped, forced into steadiness. "A card, my lord. A card with a message." Peter's eyes sharpened. "A message is always an act of vanity. What did it say?" Parker reached into a file and produced an evidence sleeve. Inside was an ordinary visiting card, cream and thick, with a sort of restraint that suggested money. On it, in a cramped hand, were printed the words, "The angle sum is always true." Peter took the sleeve delicately, as though it might stain his fingers with meaning. He read the words twice, then he said, in a voice almost conversational, "Always true," he repeated, "even when the triangle is drawn on a sphere." Parker stared. Sir Alaric blinked as though struck. Peter handed back the card. "I'm sorry," he said. "That was pedantry. You see, the angle sum is only always true in Euclidean geometry. On a curved surface—" "Yes," said Parker with forced patience. "Thank you, Peter." Peter smiled faintly. "But whoever wrote that," he went on, "either believes he's very clever or believes you are very stupid. Both are dangerous opinions in a murderer." Mrs. Harcourt spoke abruptly. "They think it was ritual." Sir Alaric's jaw tightened. "The village is already whispering," he said. "There are those in Marlow Street, Jude, who have always resented this house, and they are delighted to find it tainted with—" He hesitated, then forced the word out like a physical object. "Witchcraft." Peter's eyes softened. Just a fraction. Not sympathy exactly, but interest in the human shape of fear. "Is there anyone here," he asked, "who has an enthusiasm for witches?" Parker said, "There's a local society. Odd lot. Calling themselves the Friends of the Old Ways. But we've not." Sir Alaric cut in sharply. "This Priory is not a circus for pagan theatricals. It is a place of prayer." Peter glanced around the library, at the well-fed books and the carefully chosen antiquity. "And yet," he said mildly, "it is also a place of performance, Sir Alaric. Everyone performs in their own preferred costume, even the devout." Sir Alaric flushed, and Mrs. Harcourt's eyes narrowed, as though Peter had touched something sore and true. Peter turned back to Parker. "Cause of death?" "Strangulation," Parker said. "Manual, bruising to the throat. Time of death estimated between midnight and 2. No sign of forced entry to the chapel. No footprints we can trust. Too many people trampling about now." Peter's mouth tightened. Ah, the English talent for ruining evidence by being helpful. Parker looked as though he might say something about aristocrats and trampled evidence, thought better of it, and continued. "Vale had been staying here 3 nights, invited by Sir Alaric. I had known him at Oxford," Sir Alaric said quickly, as if defending himself against implication. He was to advise upon certain questions of restoration. And he dined with the family last night, Parker said. After dinner, according to everyone, Vale went to his room at about 10. Sir Alaric retired at 11. Mrs. Harcourt at 11, said Eleanor, expression unreadable. Parker glanced down at his notes. Staff say the house was quiet by 11:30. Peter's eyes flicked to the mantel clock, a handsome thing, gold and elaborate, which announced the passage of time like a minor aristocrat making speeches at dinner. "It's a fine clock," Peter remarked. Parker's gaze sharpened. "It's also 10 minutes fast. We checked," Sir Alaric said stiffly. "It always is. My father liked it so. He said it made one punctual." Peter said, "Or anxious. A useful household discipline. Where is Vale's room?" "South wing," Parker said, "near the old cloister." Peter nodded slowly. "And the chapel is where? Relative to the house?" "Attached," Sir Alaric said, as though reluctant to admit the intimacy. "You may reach it through the cloister passage, or from outside, by the west door." "And which way was unlocked this morning?" Peter asked. "The west door," Parker replied. "From the inside." Peter's eyes half closed, as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. "So," he said, "someone in the night entered the chapel, arranged a body like a theorem, left a smug little card, and departed, locking the inside door behind him, or not locking it, since it was found unlocked." Parker said, "The west door wasn't locked at all. That's the point." Peter tilted his head. "Is it usually locked?" Sir Alaric's mouth tightened. "It should be. But the verger has become careless, or—" He stopped, as though the thought tasted bitter. Peter's gaze moved to the heavy curtains, to the books, to the fire, to the way Eleanor Harcourt's hands were clasped so tightly that the fingers had gone white. "May I see the chapel?" Peter said. Parker's jaw flexed. "All right, but don't touch anything." "My dear Charles," said Peter, "I am the very soul of restraint. Ask Bunter." Bunter, from the doorway, said nothing, but his silence conveyed the entire history of Lord Peter's restraint, which was not extensive. They went out and along the cloister passage. The cloister itself was a pastiche, stone arches, and damp flagstones, and a central court where a yew tree stood like a black thought. The air here was colder. The ticking of the clock had faded, replaced by a faint sound that might have been wind in the roof, or a whispering that the mind produced when it had begun to anticipate dread. At the chapel door, Parker stopped and produced gloves with an air of ritual. He opened the door. The chapel was dim, lit by the pale wash of day through stained glass. Saints in jewel colors, their faces grave and oddly accusatory. The floor was laid in a bold black and white pattern that made the eye uneasy, a chessboard for God. And there, in the center before the altar rail, lay the body. Dr. Gideon Vale was a man in his 40s, spare and angular, with a kind of face that belongs to the intelligent and the unpopular. And death had not improved his expression. His arms were laid out at right angles from his body, palms upward, the fingers arranged with unnatural care. Around him had been placed objects. Parker's men had not moved them yet, it seemed, though the room smelt faintly of disturbed dust and human breath. There were 6 small stones, pale and smooth, set at measured intervals. There was a broken silver crucifix, snapped cleanly at the stem. There was a compass, the drawing instrument, not the navigational, open upon the tiles, its metal legs splayed like a spider. And there, near the head, a small pocket watch, its face cracked, its hands stopped at 1:17. Peter did not approach at once. He stood at the threshold as if reading the arrangement as one reads a page. "A diagram," he murmured. "A demonstration." Parker said sharply, "We think it's meant to look like one. We don't know whether it is." Peter's gaze traveled over the tiles. The pattern beneath the body, black, white, black, white, made every object look deliberate, every shadow look significant. The stones were placed not casually but as points, the compass as a suggestion of circles, the broken crucifix as, what, blasphemy? A message? A theatrical flourish? Peter's eyes found the pocket watch. He smiled faintly, and the smile was not amused. "Stopped at 1:17, he said. "Yes," Parker replied. "We can't tell if that's the time of death. It might have been broken later." "Or earlier," Peter said. "Or never belonged to Vale at all, but it's there to make us think of time." He took one step in, careful, placing his foot on the edge of a white tile as though choosing his geometry. "What was Vale like?" he asked abruptly. Sir Alaric, standing behind, answered stiffly. "Brilliant, difficult, not—" He hesitated. "Not a man who made himself loved." Peter nodded. "And yet someone has taken the trouble to make him symbolic." Mrs. Harcourt's voice, tight, "or to make us afraid." Peter's eyes flicked to her. "Fear is always economical," he said. "It does a great deal of work for very little effort." He stooped slightly, not touching anything, merely looking closer. His eyes lingered on Vale's collar, on the bruising at the throat, on the faint specks of something dark on the cuff. Dried mud? Ash? Ink? Then his gaze rose to the altar rail, and from there to the choir stalls. "You've got a splendid acoustic," he observed, conversational again. "One could whisper at the altar and be heard at the door, or scream and have it swallowed. Depends on the woodwork." Parker's eyes narrowed. "Why are you talking about acoustics?" "Because," said Peter, "people who arrange bodies like proofs are fond of controlling what is seen. They may also wish to control what is heard." He stepped back as though satisfied for the moment, and looked up at the stained glass saints. "They all look as though they knew," he remarked. "That's the trouble with saints. They never look surprised." Parker said, "Peter, say—" Peter raised a hand gently, still looking upward. "Tell me," he said, "did anyone here hear anything in the night? A door? A bell? Footsteps in the cloister?" Sir Alaric shook his head too quickly. "No." Mrs. Harcourt said after a pause, "I heard the clock strike 1, or I thought I did." Peter's head turned slightly. "Which clock?" "The one in the hall," she said. "It strikes the quarters." Parker looked at her sharply. "You didn't mention that." Her face colored. "I thought it was nothing." Peter murmured as if to himself, "Nothing is the most expensive item in an English household. It costs lives." He glanced down again at the pocket watch, stopped at 1:17. "Very good," he said softly. 1 o'clock. 1:17. A bell rung once at 7:10. A clock 10 minutes fast. Somebody is very interested in time and in other people's assumptions about it," Parker said, impatient now. "You've seen it. We'll go back." Peter lingered one moment longer, his eyes on the checkered pavement. "Geometry," he said. "It's supposed to be certainty. Proof. But the trouble with proofs is that they only work if you accept the axioms." He looked at Parker and smiled. Pleasantly, politely, enigmatically. "My dear Charles," he said, "what are we assuming in this case that we've no right to assume?" And with that, he turned away from the body as though it were merely a disagreeable problem set by an arrogant tutor. Behind them, the chapel held its silence, dim, orderly, and faintly obscene in its careful arrangement, like a room in which someone has made a joke too clever to laugh at. Outside, the wind moved in the cloister court, and the yew tree stood motionless, as though listening. Back in the library, the air had that curious quality one sometimes finds in houses where something irrevocable has happened. A polite attempt at normality, as though the curtains, the books, or the very furniture had been instructed to behave, and not to let on. Parker had taken up a position by the writing table with his notebook and an expression which implied that, if facts could be bullied into order, he would do it. Sir Alaric remained upright by the hearth, as if sitting down might constitute moral surrender. Mrs. Harcourt, when she sat at all, chose the edge of a chair in the manner of a person prepared to spring, either to assistance or to escape. Peter, however, wandered. He had the idle, dilatory movements of a man searching for a cigar case. Only his eyes did not idle. They moved over objects with the same grave attention he had given the dead man, and if his hands strayed now and then to a book spine or the lip of a vase, it was with a delicacy which made the act seem absent-minded rather than inquisitorial. "Well?" Parker demanded at last. "Any brilliant inspirations about triangles on spheres?" "My dear Charles," said Peter, "I should be disappointed if you hadn't checked whether the chapel floor is Euclidean." Parker did not smile. He never smiled when he suspected Peter of enjoying himself. Sir Alaric made a thin, impatient gesture. "If you can help us, Lord Peter, if you can prevent this becoming a scandal—" "Scandal," murmured Peter, a word which means, in England, truth made audible. "Let us begin with what is audible." He turned suddenly to Mrs. Harcourt. "You said you heard the hall clock strike 1, not 1:17, not a quarter after, precisely 1? I suppose so," she said. "It chimes the quarter hours, but I woke at the hour. It was as though—" She checked herself, so that her mouth tightened, as though the sound pushed itself into the room. "Your room is where?" "In the East Range, above the morning room." Peter nodded, as if placing her in an invisible diagram. "And the hall clock is—" "In the main hall," Parker put in shortly, "halfway between the East Range and the cloister passage." "Splendid," said Peter. "So if Mrs. Harcourt hears it clearly, it is either a loud clock, a quiet house, or a wakeful conscience. We shall test which later." Sir Alaric's lips compressed. Peter turned to him with the mildness of one addressing a difficult rector. "You did not hear it?" "No." "You sleep soundly?" "I sleep—" Sir Alaric hesitated, as though the confession were indecent, "with the aid of chloral." "The doctor—" "Uh-huh," said Peter. "Not Dr. Vale, I imagine." Sir Alaric's face flickered. "No." Parker scribbled, then looked up. "Peter, stick to the point." "I'm sticking," said Peter. "Like a burr. I merely choose my fabric." He walked to the mantel clock and stood regarding it. 10 minutes fast," he said. "Kept so by tradition. Does it strike?" "No," said Mrs. Harcourt. "Only the hall clock strikes." "And the chapel bell was rung once at 7:10, Peter went on. "Who hears that bell ordinarily?" "The whole house, if the wind's right," Parker answered. "The village, too." "And was the bell rope tampered with?" Peter asked casually, as though inquiring after the state of the drains. Parker stared. "We haven't looked at the rope particularly." Peter inclined his head. "Do. A bell rung once is either an accident or a signal. Accidents and signals are cousins. One must meet the family." Mrs. Harcourt said suddenly, "Mrs. Dobson heard it from the housekeeper's room and thought it was odd, because it was only once." "Mrs. Dobson is observant," said Peter, "or anxious, or trained." Sir Alaric made a sharp sound. "Dobson has been with us 20 years. "Then she has had 20 years to learn what this house expects her to notice," said Peter pleasantly, "and what it expects her not to." Parker shut his notebook with a snap. "Let's take statements. Properly. One at a time. I'll have Dobson in first." "Don't bully her," Peter murmured. "Housekeepers respond to bullying the way cats do, by appearing compliant and storing the memory." Parker glowered, rang the bell, and in due course Mrs. Dobson appeared, small, neat, and furnished with that contained authority which makes a housekeeper seem the true owner of any property. And her face had the rigid composure of a woman who has decided that emotion is a kind of mess. "Mrs. Dobson," Parker began, "tell Lord Peter what you found." "Yes, Inspector." She spoke with the careful, clipped diction of respectable service. I went, as usual, to see to the chapel. It being Thursday, we have prayers at 8, and I always like to make sure everything is decent, even if Mr. Wicks, this with a faint dryness, is not yet come with the key. I found the west door unlatched, which is not right. I went in. I saw the gentleman, Dr. Vale, lying on the floor. I did not go near him. I went out at once and rang for Cook and for Mr. Gedge. Mr. Gedge? Peter echoed. The butler, my lord, Mr. Albert Gedge. And what did Mr. Gedge do? He told me not to touch anything and went to fetch Sir Alaric. Very proper, said Peter. And you noticed anything? A smell? A draught? A window open? Mrs. Dobson's eyes flickered. It was cold. As one would expect, said Peter, from the weather or from the dead. I couldn't say, my lord. Peter nodded gravely, accepting the rebuff as one accepts a rule of grammar. Parker resumed. You said you heard the bell at 7:10. Yes, Inspector. Only once. And where were you? In my room, over the kitchens. Peter murmured. Near enough to the west door to hear a latch, perhaps. Mrs. Dobson's eyes went briefly to him and away again. I did not hear any door, my lord, only the bell, and then I thought perhaps the rope had slipped in the wind. Peter said, or someone wished you to think so. Parker shot him a warning look, but Peter had already turned to Mrs. Dobson again, amiable as ever. One more thing, he said. In the cloister passage, there is a little line of grit by the skirting board. Do you sweep there yourself? Mrs. Dobson's composure cracked ever so slightly, as if a hairline fracture had appeared in good china. No, my lord, that is usually young Lottie's work. Lottie, repeated Peter. And who is Lottie when she is at home? A kitchen maid, my lord. New, only 3 months. Excellent, said Peter. New people are always so obliging. They bring in fresh ignorance. Parker said abruptly, That'll do for now. Send Lottie in next. Mrs. Dobson withdrew, her back straight, her mouth tight. When the door had closed, Peter leaned toward Parker and spoke softly. Charles, do you know why murderers set scenes? To throw you off. Sometimes, said Peter, but more often to throw themselves on. It is a confession in decoration. High in this, he added, with a glance toward the chapel wing as though he could see through stone, is a confession written in geometry. The question is, to whom is it addressed? Parker looked at him, exasperated. Peter, for God's sake, have you got anything concrete? Peter smiled without humor. Only one thing. Whoever arranged that body wanted us to think about time. 1:17. 1 strike. 10 minutes fast. And not because he loves clocks. Because he loves alibis. At that moment, the door opened again, and the kitchen maid came in, young, pink-cheeked, wide-eyed, with hands reddened from water and fear. She glanced at the men as if they were judges. Then, inexplicably, her eyes went to Peter with a kind of desperate appeal, as though she sensed in him not mercy exactly, but a more complicated danger. Peter rose and gave her a little bow, as though she were a duchess. Miss Lottie, he said, we are going to talk about sweeping. Lottie advanced a step, then stopped as though the carpet had become suddenly indecorous. She was, Peter observed, of that honest rustic type which the gentry are fond of calling a good girl, meaning chiefly that she has not yet learned to lie with elegance. Her cap strings were untied. She kept rubbing one thumb over the other as though trying to erase a thought. Parker, who had the police instinct for making the innocent feel guilty and the guilty feel affronted, began in his official voice. Your name? Charlotte Briggs, sir, but they calls me Lottie. How long have you been here? Since August, sir. And you sweep the cloister passage? Yes, sir, after breakfast. And again if folks has been in and out? Because the leaves? She glanced nervously towards Sir Alaric, as if leaves might be a personal insult. Peter interposed suavely. Leaves are revolutionary things, Miss Briggs. They insist on falling where they please. Now, this morning, did you sweep? Lottie shook her head quickly. No, my lord. Not yet. We was all in a taking after Mrs. Dobson come running. So the grit I saw in the passage was there from last night. I suppose so, my lord. And last night, Peter said, did you sweep as usual? Yes, my lord. After tea, I done the cloister and the passage to the chapel. Mrs. Dobson likes it clean there because of prayers. Quite, said Peter. And did you notice anything that did not belong in the clean passage? Lottie frowned hard. The way the young frown when they are afraid their memory will betray them. There was some dust, my lord, like plaster. Sir Alaric made a sound. Plaster? It weren't much, Lottie said hurriedly. Just a little line by the wall, like when Mr. Wick's been in the chapel and he carries things, and some falls off. Peter's eyes narrowed, not unkindly. Mr. Wicks is the verger. Yes, my lord. He's always got keys and such, and he talks about the old walls and what's crumbling. Peter nodded, as though the notion of crumbling walls were a moral allegory. And did you see Mr. Wicks last night? No, my lord. He don't come late. Parker said sharply, did you see anyone in that passage after 10 o'clock? Lottie's eyes widened. No, sir. Are you sure? Parker pressed. Lottie swallowed. I was in the kitchen after 10, sir, and helping cook. And then I went up to my bed. Peter said gently, what time do you go up to bed, Miss Briggs? 10:30, my lord. Sometimes 11 if cook's bad-tempered. Cook is frequently bad-tempered? Peter inquired with mild interest. Oh, yes, my lord, said Lottie with the involuntary candor of the very young. But not in a wicked way, only in a hungry way. Sir Alaric looked as though he had never encountered hunger except in books. Mrs. Harcourt's mouth twitched again, the first sign, Peter thought, that she might be capable of laughter in spite of herself. Peter leaned forward. When you went up last night, did you hear anything? A bell, a door, footsteps in the cloister? Lottie hesitated, her hands clenched on her apron. I heard a sort of sound, she said reluctantly. Like the chapel door, not the big outside one, the inside one. Parker's head came up. When? I don't know, sir. It was after I was in bed. Peter's voice remained mild, but it had acquired that faint edge of precision which made people suddenly wish they had been more careful. I heard a sort of sound, she said reluctantly. Like the chapel door, not the big outside one, the inside one. Parker's head came up. When? I don't know, sir. It was after I was in bed. Peter's voice remained mild, but it had acquired that faint edge of precision which made people suddenly wish they had been more careful with their memories. You went up at 10:30, he said. You fell asleep, quickly. Not right away, my lord. My feet ached. So you lay awake, said Peter, in the agreeable company of aching feet and cook's temper. How long? Lottie stared at him, helpless. I couldn't say, my lord. No, said Peter. That is the trouble with time. It behaves like a gentleman. If you don't watch him, he goes off with your purse. Parker rapped his pencil. Did you get up? Did you look out? Did you hear any voices? No, sir, I didn't get up. I only heard like a door, and then like someone walking, soft, in the cloister, maybe. Sir Alaric said sharply, That's nonsense. The cloister echoes. Anyone would hear. Peter lifted a hand. Echoes, he said, are the most honest witnesses. They repeat everything without understanding, which is more than can be said of most people. He turned to Lottie again. You said you did not mean the west door. You meant the inside door from the cloister into the chapel. Yes, my lord, that one. And it sounded, Peter pursued, so as though it were pulled to, or as though it were pushed open. Lottie blinked. Pulled to, I think. like when it don't catch right and you have to pull it so it clicks. Parker and Sir Alaric looked at one another. Parker's expression suggested he had at last been given something he could put in a report. Sir Alaric suggested he had been given something he would prefer to burn. Peter said thoughtfully, "So someone may have come out of the chapel and taken care to make the door click shut." He let that hang for a moment. A click, a footstep, a bell rung once. Such trifles, yet murder, like a well-bred scandal, is always made up of trifles arranged with intention. "Did you hear the hall clock strike 1?" he asked suddenly. Lottie shook her head violently. "No, my lord, not from the attic. We don't hear it well up there." "Quite," said Peter. "And the chapel bell at 7:10. You heard that?" "Yes, my lord." "From the kitchens you would," Peter said. "Now, this is important, Miss Briggs. You mentioned plaster dust, a line by the skirting. You noticed it last night." "Yes, my lord." "And this morning," Peter said, "did you see the dust again?" Lottie hesitated. Parker snapped, "Answer the question." She stammered, flushing. "I didn't look, sir. I weren't thinking about sweeping. I was thinking about the gentleman in the chapel." "Never apologize for that," said Peter gently. "It is better to think about the dead than about the floor. Floors will wait." Parker's impatience had the look of a man watching a fish wriggle toward freedom. "All right," he said curtly. "You can go. And don't talk to anyone about what you've said. Not to the other girls, not to your mother, not to anyone." Lottie bobbed, wide-eyed, and scuttled out as though the room were on fire. When she had gone, Sir Alaric said, very low, "Why did you ask about plaster?" Peter wandered back toward the window, peering through a gap in the curtain at the wet lawn and the ew's black composure. "Because plaster," he said, "is the sort of thing that falls when someone has been meddling with the fabric of a building, and meddling with fabric in a place like this is terribly like meddling with alibis." Parker said, "We've got a red herring already. Wicks. He's got keys, he knows the chapel, he's the one who ought to lock the west door, and there's this dust." "Does Mr. Wicks drink?" Peter asked. Parker stared. "Ah, what's that got to do with it?" "It makes him," said Peter, "either more likely to be careless or more likely to be useful as an explanation. Both are attractive to a murderer." Sir Alaric, whose idea of vice was probably an untidy hymn book, said stiffly, "Wicks is a respectable man. He has served this parish for years." "Respectable men," said Peter, "are often those who have learned to commit their sins without leaving fingerprints." Parker opened his notebook again. "We'll bring Wicks in." "Not yet," Peter said. Parker looked up, bristling. "Why not?" "Because," Peter replied, "you will ask him whether he locked the door. He will say yes. You will tell him you found it unlatched. He will say he must have forgotten. You will feel satisfied, because you can see the end of a sentence that begins carelessness." Parker said, "Doesn't you?" "I should like," said Peter, "to know whether he could have forgotten." Sir Alaric's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Peter turned from the window and smiled, almost apologetically. "I mean that habits are more reliable than virtue. If Wicks has locked that door every day for 10 years, he will not suddenly forget on the very night a murder is committed, unless someone has arranged for him to forget, or unless someone has arranged for us to need him to forget." Mrs. Harcourt, who had been silent for several minutes, said quietly, "You think the door was left open on purpose?" "I think," said Peter, "that nothing about that chapel was left to chance. Even the vulgarity of the card was calculated." Parker said grimly, "Now then, what do you want to do first?" Peter's gaze moved to the tall bookcase near the fireplace. Books of theology and antiquarian pamphlets standing side by side, with the uneasy intimacy of neighbors who disapprove of each other but share the same damp wall. "I want," he said, "to understand Dr. Vale, not his death, his life, because someone has written a message on his chest as though answering a question he asked, or as though accusing him of asking it. Sir Alaric's mouth tightened. Vale was engaged upon certain investigations. Yes, said Peter. You mentioned restoration. Medieval remains. Priory history. Those are charming subjects for people who like the dead better than the living. Did he discover anything here that made you uneasy? Sir Alaric's colour rose. Certainly not. Peter inclined his head. Then there is no harm in telling me precisely what he was doing. Parker watched Sir Alaric with the professional suspicion of a man who has seen too many respectable faces trying to behave like blank walls. Mrs. Harcourt's eyes were fixed on her husband, steady, as though she were waiting for him to tell a truth she already knew. Sir Alaric said at last, in a voice stiff with self-command. He was examining the old foundations. There is a passage beneath the chapel, a remnant, possibly pre-Reformation. Vale believed it might contain... He hesitated. The word stuck as though it had thorns. Contain what? Peter prompted gently. A hiding place, Sir Alaric said almost inaudibly. A priest hole, documents, Catholic relics. I told him it was fanciful. Peter said softly. And did he take your word for it? Sir Alaric's silence was answer enough. Parker said, So he was poking about under the chapel. That accounts for plaster and dust. Perhaps, said Peter. Or perhaps it accounts for something else. He turned to Bunter, who had been standing unobtrusively near the door like an idea that refuses to leave. Bunter, he said, would you be so good as to inquire, delicately, where Dr. Vale kept his papers and effects, and whether any are missing? Yes, my lord. Bunter withdrew, noiseless as ever. Parker looked at Peter sharply. You think something's been taken? I think, said Peter, that if a man is killed and then arranged like a schoolboy's geometry exercise, someone is trying to make us look at the shape of the thing instead of the contents of his pockets. Mrs. Harcourt's voice came thinly. And the faint talk in the village? The old ways? Peter glanced at her. Ah, the Gothic garnish. Very useful. If one wishes a rational crime to be dressed as superstition, one merely provides the locals with a vocabulary, and they do the rest. Sir Alaric said harshly. This house is not, Peter interrupted, pleasantly relentless. Sir Alaric, if Dr. Vale believed there was a passage under the chapel, who besides yourself knew it? Sir Alaric's gaze flicked away. No one, he said. Parker snorted. No one ever means no one. Peter smiled. Quite. No one generally means. No one I can admit to knowing. Sir Alaric's hands clenched. Mrs. Dobson would have heard talk. Wicks, perhaps. Vale himself was not discreet. And Mrs. Harcourt? Peter asked. Eleanor's chin lifted. I knew. Sir Alaric's head snapped round. Eleanor, she said coldly, you spoke of it at dinner. You spoke of everything at dinner. It was your idea of being frank. Peter observed them, his expression mild, but his mind making its quiet tally. So, he said, we have at least 4 persons aware of an alleged Undercroft passage. Vale, Sir Alaric, Mrs. Harcourt, and possibly the verger and housekeeper by hearsay. And someone rings the bell once at 7:10, as though to say, come and look. Parker said, you still haven't told me why 117 matters. Peter's eyes grew suddenly distant, as though he were seeing the checkered pavement again. 117, he said, is either a time or a number, or a piece of theatre. But theatre is usually done for an audience. So the question is, who in this house would recognize 117 as a cue? He paused, and his voice softened into that tone of idle quotation with which he sometimes concealed seriousness. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, he murmured. But most of them, Charles, are in the timetable. Bunter returned at that moment, and even his impassive face seemed charged with a certain restrained unease. My lord, he said quietly, Dr. Vale's dispatch case is in his room. It has been opened. Several papers appear to have been removed. Bunter's report fell into the room like a small, neatly folded bomb. "My lord," he said quietly, "Dr. Vale's dispatch case is in his room. It has been opened. Several papers appear to have been removed." Parker, who had the fortunate quality of being unable to romanticize theft, moved at once. "Show me." They went up by a staircase whose treads, worn to a shallow concavity, they seemed to offer the faintest resistance, as though the house itself disliked being climbed in a hurry. The south wing smelt older than the rest, stone, dust, a suggestion of extinguished candles. There were pictures on the walls, Harcourts of earlier generations staring down with that bland ancestral confidence which assumes posterity will continue to make itself respectable. Vale's room was one of those guest chambers which country houses keep ready like spare consciences. Clean, correct, faintly impersonal, and not in the least designed for dying. The bed was neatly made. The wardrobe door stood ajar. On the table by the window lay the opened dispatch case. Brown leather, good quality, now looking oddly violated, as though it had been a private person stripped in public. Parker put on gloves and leaned over it. "No, any sign of forcing?" Bunter shook his head. "No, Inspector. The clasp is sound. It may have been opened with the key, or without effort if left unlocked." Peter, who had not moved from the threshold, let his gaze travel over the room as if reading it aloud in silence. There was a pair of boots by the bed, mud dried on the soles. There was a damp overcoat hanging from a peg, heavy with the smell of autumn. On the washstand, a shaving brush lay as though abandoned mid-ritual. Vale had expected to wake and continue being alive. "What papers are missing?" Parker demanded. Bunter answered with maddening propriety. "It is difficult to say with certainty, sir, since one cannot inventory an absence without knowing the original order. But there are loose sheets remaining, notes on measurements, and a sketch of the chapel floor. And the spaces suggest that a packet, perhaps tied with tape, has been removed." Peter said softly, "A packet? How satisfyingly old-fashioned. One always hopes, in these places, to find secrets tied up with string." Parker looked round sharply. "Peter, do you see anything else?" Peter stepped in, lightly, and moved to the window. It overlooked the cloister court and, beyond, the chapel's small west porch. The yew tree stood there, black and self-contained. Rain had left a sheen on everything, as though the world had been varnished. "Vale was working under the chapel," Peter said. "If he found something, he would write it down. If someone else wanted it, they'd take the notes. But it's awkward to steal a man's papers if the man is alive to complain." Parker said, "So you think the robbery's the motive?" "I think," said Peter, "that the robbery is the shape of the motive. The motive itself may be quite different." He turned away from the window and walked to the boots. He did not touch them. He only looked at the soles with an expression of polite interest, as though discussing footwear at a club. "Mud," he observed. Parker grunted. "There's mud everywhere." "Not that sort," said Peter mildly. "That is chalky, the kind you get near old foundations, or near a place where someone has been digging, quietly, while telling you they have been doing nothing at all." Parker straightened. "You think Vale went down there last night?" "Possibly," said Peter. "Or someone went down there and wants us to think Vale did." Bunter, who had been examining the writing table with discreet thoroughness, said, "My lord, there is also this." He held out a small object, a piece of thin paper folded into a narrow strip, as though torn from the margin of something larger. There were faint pencil markings on it, numbers and a few letters, made with the hurried pressure of a man who had not expected to die before breakfast. Parker took it. "What the devil is that? Coordinates?" Peter glanced, and his eyelids flickered. "Not coordinates," he said. "More like a tally. Look, 117 again, and W." Parker's face hardened. "Wicks." Or west, Peter said. Or window, or whimsy, if Vale was in an especially prophetic mood. Parker gave him a look. Don't. Peter smiled faintly. Very well. We shall be dull and say Wicks until it proves embarrassing. Mrs. Harcourt had followed them up and stood now in the doorway, and one hand on the jamb as if steadying herself against the house. Her voice came out thin. He wrote that. It appears so, Parker said. She stared at the scrap as though it were a relic. So he knew before... Peter cut in gently. Not necessarily. Men scribble all sorts of things, particularly men who fancy themselves pursued by history. Sir Alaric, arriving last, looked into the room with distaste, as if the mere sight of disorder offended his conception of propriety. This is intolerable, he said. My house ransacked. Your guest ransacked, said Parker. Sir Alaric flinched, then recovered. Yes, that, of course. But who would dare? Who would know he had papers worth taking? Peter turned and studied him with a mild, impersonal attention which nevertheless had the effect of undressing statements. Who indeed? He said. Let us list those who knew Vale was investigating your Undercroft fantasy. Yourself, your wife, perhaps Wicks, perhaps Dobson, any member of staff who heard talk, and any visitor to whom Vale could not resist being clever. Sir Alaric's mouth tightened. There have been no visitors. Peter inclined his head. Then we are spared the modern nuisance of strangers. Parker said grimly, We'll need to search the servants' quarters. And question Wicks. Peter, who was drifting toward the fireplace, paused at the mantel. A small travelling clock sat there, its face enamelled, its hands steady. It was not striking, merely existing, an ornament of time. Tell me, Charles, he said, what time did you say Mrs. Dobson found the chapel? About 7:30. And the bell rang at 7:10, Peter murmured. 20 minutes. Are enough to rouse a housekeeper, dress, cross a yard, and discover a theatrical corpse. Parker said, What of it? Peter looked up, and the light in his eyes sharpened. What of it? He echoed. Well, if one wished to be discovered, one would ring a bell. If one wished to be discovered, and to ensure the discovery happened before staff could do their usual small acts of tidying, one would ring it at a time when the household is already stirring. 7:10 is a very domestic hour. It is the hour of kettles, boots, and alibis. Mrs. Harcourt said abruptly, You keep saying alibis. Yes, said Peter almost kindly, because people do not generally arrange corpses for the fun of it. They do it because they are afraid of something more damning than death, something like sequence. Time is a terrible witness, and it remembers in order. Parker folded the scrap of paper into an evidence envelope. All right, we've got missing papers, a scribble about 117 and W, and a room opened without forcing. That's enough to go on. Peter's gaze, however, had slid again to the window, past the cloister, past the chapel porch, to the wet lawn and the yew. And we have, he said softly, a house designed to make sound behave strangely. A bell rung once, a clock heard by one person and not another, and a door that clicks in the night. He turned to Parker with a sudden briskness. Charles, how thick are the chapel walls? Parker blinked. What? Are they thick enough? Peter said, to swallow a struggle, or thin enough to let it leak out as a whisper? We mustn't assume the murder happened where the body was displayed, or murderers are like stage managers. They prefer the audience to look where the lighting is best. Parker exhaled sharply. You want to inspect the Undercroft? I want, said Peter, to see where plaster dust comes from. And I want to know whether a man could move through that chapel unseen, like a ghost, without requiring the services of the supernatural. Sir Alaric's eyes flashed. There is no passage. Peter's tone remained airy, but his words were precise. There is either a passage, he said, or there is a reason why you need there not to be one, and both are equally interesting. A silence settled. one of those silences full of careful breathing and unspoken resentment. Outside, the rain made a faint ticking on the leaded panes like another clock in a house already too fond of time. Then Bunter spoke again, as though offering a tray. "My lord, if I may add, Dr. Vale's pocketbook is still here. There is money in it. The theft was selective." Peter's eyes narrowed, and for the first time that day, his humor seemed to retreat, leaving something colder behind. "Selective," he repeated. Then the murder was not for gain in the vulgar sense. It was for control. Someone wanted what Vale knew, what he had put into words. And if they could not rewrite it, they removed it. He picked up his gloves with the air of a man about to begin a disagreeable hobby. "Come," he said quietly. "Let us go and look for the geometry's missing line." They went down, not by any romantic spiral stair concealed behind a tapestry. Houses such as this, for all their Gothic aspirations, seldom provide conveniences for melodrama, but by a narrow service stair at the end of the south wing, the sort of stair built for trays and whispered errands. It had been fitted at some later date with electric light. Nevertheless, the bulbs contrived to cast shadows in the corners with the conscientious industry of a monk illuminating devils in a margin. Parker took the lead with a police lantern, because police lanterns, like police minds, are designed to throw hard light on whatever they choose to see. Bunter followed with the calm of a man who had once navigated trenches and now refused to be impressed by mere stone. Peter came last, not from timidity but from habit. He liked to watch people's backs, because people did their most truthful thinking when they believed themselves unobserved. At the foot of the stair was a door, thick oak, iron-bound, theatrical enough to satisfy the Priory's sense of itself. Sir Alaric produced a key with an air of offended proprietorship. "This is merely a storage vault," he said. "Wine, old furniture." "Excellent," said Peter. "If there is one thing murder enjoys, it is old furniture." The key turned. The door opened with a reluctant groan, as though protesting against the disturbance of respectable decay. A smell came out. Damp stone, mold, and the faint, sweet ghost of spilled port. The vault beyond was low and irregular, its walls older than the chapel above. Rough stone, patched here and there with later brick. Crates and broken chairs stood in ranks like an army of the discarded. At the far end, in a corner, half hidden by a wardrobe without drawers, was an arch, bricked up, but not with the complacent solidity of proper masonry. The bricks were different, the mortar a different color. The whole looked, to Peter's eye, like a lie told by an amateur. Parker's lantern swung toward it at once. "What's that?" he demanded. Sir Alaric's mouth tightened. "An old opening, sealed years ago. Unsafe." Peter strolled nearer, apparently absorbed in the wine racks. "How very prudent," he remarked, "and how very convenient to have prudence placed precisely where curiosity would otherwise go." Parker crouched and scraped at the mortar with a gloved finger. The little powder came away, pale, chalky, fresh compared with the surrounding grime. "Recently done," Parker said, and his voice had that pleased hardness policemen get when a thing stops being atmospheric and begins being prosecutable. "Or redone. Look at the color." Sir Alaric's face colored. "This is absurd. I had repairs made in the summer. Damp." "In August," said Peter softly. "Perhaps. About the time Miss Briggs arrived, and about the time Dr. Vale began making himself at home with your foundations." Sir Alaric turned on him. "Are you accusing me?" "No," said Peter gently. "I'm accusing your house. Houses are always guilty. They conceal, they echo, they suggest." Mrs. Harcourt had come down behind them. In the lantern light, she looked less like a widow in training and more like a woman who had learned to keep her nerves in a tight fist. "That wall was not repaired in the summer," she said quietly. Sir Alaric's head snapped round. "Eleanor." "It was not," she repeated, with the calm insistence of someone correcting a child who has misnamed an object. The vault was not touched. You forbid the servants to go there. Parker rose. Sir Alaric, who bricked this up? Sir Alaric's hands clenched. I don't know. Peter's voice, still courteous, acquired a faint chill. Sir Alaric, a man is dead in your chapel and his papers are missing. I should strongly recommend, for your own comfort, that you discover a more useful phrase than I don't know. For a moment, Sir Alaric looked as though he might collapse into indignation or confession. Then pride came to his rescue. Wicks has keys, he said harshly. Dobson, any of them. Peter's eyes went to the bricked arch again. Keys don't help with bricks, he observed. Bricks require time and privacy, and a place where the sound of chipping mortar would not carry. Parker swung his lantern around, surveying the vault. The low ceiling, the stacked furniture, the wine bins, all of it would muffle sound. A man could work here at night, Parker said, thinking aloud. Summer nobody would hear. Unless, Peter murmured, somebody did hear and called it an old house settling. He bent slightly, and his gaze went to the floor. There were footprints, not clear enough for Parker's satisfaction, but clear enough for Peter's mind. A smear of pale dust, a scuff where a boot had dragged. Near the base of the bricked arch lay a tiny crescent of plaster, freshly broken, like a fingernail clipping. Peter straightened. This, he said, is where your plaster line came from, Miss Briggs. The dust did not fall in the cloister by accident. It traveled. Parker's head snapped up. From here to the cloister? Peter nodded. On a boot, on a hem, on a dragged object. One doesn't need to carry a corpse to carry dust. Mrs. Harcourt's voice came sharp suddenly. You mean he was killed down here? I mean, said Peter, as that the chapel is a stage. This is a workshop. Sir Alaric made a strangled sound. Impossible. Vale, Peter interrupted, was an antiquarian. An antiquarian will go anywhere if you tell him there is something old and forbidden, particularly if you tell him it is impossible. Parker said, We'll have this wall taken down. Sir Alaric flung out a hand. You can't simply... This is my property. Parker's expression did not change. It's evidence. Peter, watching Sir Alaric, said lightly, Besides, sir, if there is nothing behind it, you lose nothing but a little masonry. If there is something behind it, you gain your honesty back. It seems a fair bargain. Sir Alaric's lips whitened. Very well. Do what you like. Parker sent for men. While they went, Peter wandered a few steps away, as if bored. Megan paused by a stack of hymn books in a broken crate, mildewed, swollen, their gilt titles dim. He picked one up, opened it, and sniffed, like a connoisseur of must. Chloral, he murmured. Parker looked round sharply. What? Peter held the hymn book up. A faint medicinal odor clung to the damp paper, sweet, sickly. Somebody, he said, has spilled something here recently. Something not quite as innocent as port. Mrs. Harcourt stared. In a vault? People hide what they cannot pour down the sink, said Peter, or what they do not wish the staff to find in the bedroom. Parker's voice was flat. You think someone drugged Vale? I think, said Peter, that if Vale fought, someone risked being scratched, heard, seen. If Vale was drowsy, docile, as amused by his own cleverness, then someone could lead him down here with a story about secret passages and let the house swallow him whole. Sir Alaric said hoarsely, Eleanor said I take chloral. Are you suggesting... Peter's gaze moved over him, and for a fraction of a second the mask of ironic detachment slipped, showing something like pity or disgust. I suggest nothing, Peter said softly. I merely note odors. Odors are rarely invited guests. Parker's men arrived with tools. The first strike of a chisel against mortar sounded unnaturally loud in the low vault, as if the place resented being made to confess. Dust fell, pale, chalky. the same dust that had left its delicate line along the cloister skirting board. They worked for some minutes. The gap widened. A cold air breathed out from behind the brickwork, air that smelt not of wine or damp furniture, but of earth and something older, the dry, closed smell of a space long unentered. When the last bricks gave way, the lantern light fell into a narrow passage beyond. It ran away into darkness, its floor uneven, its walls rough. And on the threshold, just inside, where a man stepping out would naturally place his foot, there was a neat impression in dust. The print of a boot, heel turned slightly inward, as though the wearer favored one leg. Peter looked at it for a long time without speaking. Parker, impatient, said, "Well?" Peter lifted his eyes. "Our ghost," he said quietly, "has a limp." Behind him, Sir Alaric made a small involuntary sound, so quick it might have been mistaken for a cough, if one wished to be charitable. Mrs. Harcourt, however, did not look at her husband. She looked at the passage, and her face had gone quite still, like a woman recognizing something she had always pretended was not there. Peter stepped nearer to the opening but did not enter. He was smiling again, not his flippant smile, but the thin, abstracted one that came when his mind had found a pattern and was considering whether it was beautiful or merely deadly. 117, he murmured, almost to himself. A queue, a door that clicks, a bell rung once, and now an old passage unsealed. He turned to Parker. "Charles," he said, "before you charge down there like St. George after a dragon, ask yourself, why brick it up at all? Not to keep us out. We are late. It was bricked to keep something in, or to keep someone's root secret." Parker stared into the dark passage, lantern held out. "As we'll search it." "Yes," said Peter. "And while you search it, remember, whoever arranged that geometry in the chapel wanted you looking upward, at symbols. The truth, I suspect, is under your feet." Parker's men went first, because policemen have an instinct for putting their bodies where their doubts are. The lantern beam slid along the passage and showed, in brief, hard flashes, rough stone sweating with age, a floor of packed earth and broken flag, and here and there the pale bloom of disturbed dust, as though some sleeper had lately turned in his bed. The air down there was different, colder, drier, with a mineral tang that made the back of the throat tighten. It had not the smell of a place that is merely unused. It had the smell of a place that has been kept unused, which is a far more deliberate condition. Peter lingered at the threshold while Parker plunged on, and his delay was not hesitation so much as courtesy to his own mind. He was listening, not for supernatural whispers. He had none of the modern appetite for being frightened by bad plumbing, but for the small sounds that tell the truth, the scuff of a boot on grit, the hollow note when a flagstone is not properly bedded, the soft scrape of wool against stone. Bunter, close behind him, said quietly, "My lord, there is a draught." "Yes," Peter murmured. "A draught means an opening. Openings mean roots. Roots mean alibis. Everything means alibis today." He stepped in at last, careful not to disturb the neat heel-turned boot mark. The passage narrowed after a few yards and took a slight turn, enough to prevent anyone in the chapel hearing a sound from beyond, to be enough also to make a man feel irrationally that he had crossed a line. The lantern light caught on a damp smear along the wall at shoulder height, as though someone had steadied himself there with a hand. "A man with a limp," Peter said softly, "puts his hand out more often." Parker, ahead, called back impatiently, "Are you coming, or are you composing epigrams for the stones?" "I'm admiring your method," Peter returned. "It's charmingly direct, like breaking a watch to discover the time." The passage ended in a small chamber, no larger than a pantry, roofed with a low soot-dark arch. At first glance it was empty. Then the lantern beam moved, and the emptiness became meaningful. The floor had been disturbed, a patch of fresh earth, trampled, a smear of chalk dust, and, in the corner, a length of frayed rope lying as though it had been dropped rather than stored. Parker crouched. "Rope." "Yes," said Peter. "Not ecclesiastical rope. Not bell rope. That's been used for work or for a throat." Parker looked up sharply. "You think he was strangled here?" Peter did not answer at once. His eyes had gone to the wall, where something, faint but deliberate, had been scratched into the dust and soot of the stone. It was not a word. It was not even, properly, a symbol, only a set of lines intersecting, as though someone had drawn a triangle and then corrected himself. A childish scrawl, except that childish scrawls do not usually appear in hidden chambers under chapels. He leaned nearer, not touching. "The angle sum," he said. "Somebody has been practicing his little joke." Parker, who could not see jokes in scratches, said, "And it's nothing." "It is never nothing," Peter replied gently. "It is either a message or the remains of one. And if it is the remains, then someone has been here since last night and tried to tidy up." Bunter's light moved, steady, and revealed something else. A fine dusting of pale grit on the rope, and on the floor beside it a crescent-shaped chip of plaster like the one Peter had seen in the vault. Fresh, chalky, insistent. "The same dust again," Peter murmured. "Our murderer is shedding the house like an unseasonable molting." Parker rose. "This gets us nowhere unless we find a way out. There must be another opening." Peter walked the chamber's perimeter with the idle gait of a man strolling a museum, except that his eyes were sharper than any curator's. At one point he paused, head cocked, eyes unwrapped lightly, once on the stone with his knuckle. The sound came back dull, almost friendly. He rapped again, 2 inches to the left. This time it answered with a faint hollowness, a small difference that mattered. Bunter, without being told, held the lantern close. Peter said softly, "Here." Parker pushed past. "A concealed door? Or a blocked arch?" Peter said. "These places breed them the way pantries breed mice." Parker ran his gloved fingers over the stone. There was a line, almost imperceptible, where mortar had been worked differently, older than the new brickwork above, but not as old as the medieval stones. A repair, perhaps, or a concealment done in a different century by a different kind of fear. Parker straightened, satisfied. "We'll get this opened up as well." Peter's gaze, however, had drifted to the rope again. "Charles," he said, "did anyone tell you Vale had a habit of tying things with string?" Parker frowned. "No? Why?" "Because," Peter said, "if the missing packet was tied, and if the murderer came down here in haste, and if he dropped rope, then he may have torn away the string and left it behind. Triviality, except that string leaves fibers, knots leave habits, and habits leave identities." Parker looked at him with the faintly hunted patience of a man dealing with genius as with weather. "All right, we'll bag it. What else?" Peter smiled faintly in the lantern light. "What else?" he echoed. "Only this. The chapel was the performance, but this chamber is the rehearsal. Whoever did it came down here with Vale, calmly or by force, and left through a route that does not involve the west door. And therefore the unlocked west door is a lie told to the village." Parker's brow furrowed. "Then why ring the bell at 7:10? "To set the house moving," Peter said. "To force discovery before anyone could notice what was missing. To make everyone speak at once, loudly and with conviction, so that contradictions would sound like mere hysteria." Bunter said very quietly, "My lord, if I might observe, a bell rung once is also how one calls a servant." Peter looked at him with quick appreciation. "Exactly. Not a peal. Not a summons to worship. A domestic signal. Come here." Parker stared. "You think someone was expected to find the body?" "I think," Peter said, "that someone was expected to find it at a particular time and in a particular emotional state. A panic makes people clumsy with clocks." For a moment, They stood in the cramped chamber, while the lantern hissed faintly, and the damp walls seemed to close in, not physically, but in that manner old places have, of reminding you how little they care about breath. Then, from above, filtered through stone and distance, came a sound, the faint single note of a bell. Not the chapel bell, not loud enough. Something smaller, perhaps a handbell in the servants' quarters, perhaps only metal struck against metal. But it rang once, cleanly, like punctuation. Parker's head snapped up. What the devil? Peter's face in the lantern glow was suddenly very still. One, he said softly. Again. He looked at Parker, and the lightness was gone from him, leaving only that precise, chilling clarity. Charles, he said, someone is signaling, and it is not to summon prayers. Parker was already moving, because policemen do not so much decide as act, and afterwards construct reasons large enough to shelter the act from criticism. He started back along the passage at a half-trot, lantern swinging. The light lurched across the walls in frantic crescents, making every stone look momentarily like a face. Peter did not hurry. He followed at an even pace, which was more disconcerting than haste. It suggested that whatever had rung above was not an alarm to him, but a confirmation. When they emerged into the vault, the sound had ceased, leaving behind the after-sensation of vibration in the ear, like the memory of a word one cannot quite repeat. The men with tools looked up, startled and guilty, as though they had been caught ringing bells in church. "That from you?" Parker snapped, and one of the constables shook his head. "No, sir." Sir Alaric, who had not descended into the passage, either from prudence or from an unwillingness to be confronted with what his house contained, stood stiffly by the door. His face had that pale, tight look of a man whose private certainties are being forced into public view. "It's the servants' bell," he said at once. "How do you know?" Peter asked gently. Sir Alaric's eyes flickered. "Because I've lived here." Peter's head tilted as though he were listening not to Sir Alaric, but to the lie behind the sentence. "Then," he said mildly, "we shall assume you can also tell us who rings it and when." Sir Alaric's mouth tightened. "It rings in the pantry for Mr. Gedge. It rings in the kitchen for the maids. There are different pulls." "And one ring," Peter murmured. "It means what it always means in any house. Somebody wants somebody else to come at once." Parker was already on the stair, his boots loud on the treads. They climbed, and with each step the Priory's smells changed. Damp stone giving way to polish and coal dust, old mold giving way to the warmer, more intimate staleness of inhabited corridors. At the top, the passage outside the cloister was empty, but not quiet. That was the curious part, the kind of hush that has been arranged. Halfway along, a door stood ajar. Peter stopped short, and his gaze went immediately, not to the door, but to the carpet. A faint smear of pale dust lay on the runner, as though someone had stepped there with an unclean heel and then, thinking better of it, had retreated. The smear was not broad, not obvious, and it was the sort of thing that would vanish under the next conscientious sweep. Precisely the sort of thing a murderer relies on a housekeeper to destroy for him. Peter said softly, "Our plaster again. Traveling upward." Parker turned on him. "You see dust everywhere." "Yes," said Peter. "Because it is everywhere. It is the signature of your hidden passage, and whoever has it on his shoes has recently walked where he ought not." He nudged the door further open with a gloved finger. Inside was a small room, an anteroom perhaps, or a place once meant for devotional odds and ends. Now it had been turned to domestic use. Shelves of linen, folded altar cloths, a rack of candles, a little table with a ledger upon it. One might have called it harmless, if one had never met harmless rooms after midnight. And in the center of the floor, like a prop dropped at the wrong moment, lay a handbell. Brass, dull with age, its wooden handle worn smooth by use. Parker's eyes narrowed. That's what rang. Peter did not go to the bell. He looked instead at the table. A chair stood slightly askew, as though pushed back in haste or pulled forward with purpose. On the ledger, a page had been turned down at the corner. The inkpot's lid was not properly set. Someone was here, Parker said. Yes, said Peter, and not arranging corpses. Doing something they did not wish to be interrupted at. Parker bent to examine the bell. He did not touch it, yet. The bell's clapper hung still, but beside it, on the boards, was a tiny scatter of grit. Chalky, pale, familiar. Peter's eyes moved to the doorway and then along the passage beyond. It was as though he could see the route dust took through the house the way one sees, in imagination, a spill of milk across a dark table. Charles, he said quietly, where is Gedge's pantry? Parker jerked his head. Off the hall, ground floor. And the servants' stairs? Peter asked. Near the kitchen, back of the East Range. Peter nodded. So if someone wished to summon Mr. Gedge, or merely make it appear that he had been summoned, they might ring this bell, then vanish before he arrived. Parker's expression hardened. So we call Gedge in, now. Yes, said Peter, and watch not only what he says, but how quickly he appears. A butler's speed is a confession. They went down to the hall with brisker steps. The hall clock stood there, tall, dignified, and implacable, its polished face giving time with the air of a moral judgment. Mrs. Harcourt, descending behind them, stopped a pace away from it and stared at the dial as though it were an enemy. Parker noticed. You're thinking about 1 o'clock again. I'm thinking, Eleanor said, about what one believes one hears in the night, and what one is meant to hear. Peter's eyes flicked over her, quick and unreadable. Yes, he said, the night is full of noises. A clever person chooses which noise you will remember. Parker strode to the pantry door and flung it open. Mr. Albert Gedge was there, and if his presence ought to have been surprising, he did his best to make it inevitable. He was a tall man, dark-haired, with a face that had been trained into neutrality until it resembled virtue. His hands were clean, his cuffs immaculate. He looked as Bunter would have looked, had Bunter been designed for menace. Inspector, he said calmly. My lady, my lord. Peter's eyebrows lifted. You were quick, Mr. Gedge. Were you summoned? Gedge's eyes did not flicker. No, my lord, I was sorting. Sorting what? Peter asked, lightly. The silver, my lord, said Gedge. After this morning, there has been confusion. Peter nodded, as though admiring domestic diligence. Of course, he said. Confusion is bad for silver. It tarnishes. Now tell me, Mr. Gedge, did you ring a bell a few minutes ago? Gedge paused, only for the space of a polite breath. No, my lord, Parker said sharply. Did you hear one? I heard a bell, Gedge admitted, somewhere in the cloister passage. Peter said, and what did you do when you heard it? I came to see if I was needed, said Gedge. I was not, apparently. Peter's smile was thin. And you came, he said. By which route? Gedge's gaze met his without flinching. By the main passage, my lord. Peter turned his head slightly, as if considering the man's outline against the pantry shelves. Curious, he said, because someone has left plaster dust in that passage. Fresh dust. It is the sort of dust one acquires by crawling about in bricked vaults under chapels. Parker said, Peter. Peter held up a hand. No, he said quietly. Let him answer. Gedge's face remained composed, but something in the set of his jaw altered, as though a muscle had tightened of its own accord. My lord, he said, I do not go into vaults. Peter's tone stayed conversational, even whimsical. No, he agreed. You go where you are supposed to go. That is your profession. But professions have hobbies, Mr. Gedge. Tell me, do you limp? For the first time, Gedge's eyes shifted, downward, involuntarily, toward his own feet. It was the smallest betrayal, but in a house full of trained deception, it was almost obscene in its honesty. "I had an injury in the war," he said. "So did Bunter," Peter murmured, and there was a faint edge beneath the politeness now. "But Bunter does not leave fresh plaster in the cloister." Parker stepped forward. "Gedge, where were you between midnight and 2? Gedge's voice was steady. "In my room, Inspector. Asleep." "And can anyone swear to that?" Parker demanded. "No," said Gedge. "Servants do not generally share bedrooms in this house." Peter's eyes narrowed, not in triumph, but in that cold interest with which one watches a crack widen in ice. "A pity," he said softly. "Shared rooms are so inconvenient for murder." There was a pause. In it, one could hear the hall clocks ticking, patient, reproachful. Mrs. Harcourt stood very still. Peter turned away from Gedge as though bored, and walked to the hall clock. He leaned close, listening. Then he did something that, in another man, would have been meaningless. He lifted the glass door of the clock's case. A faint smell came out. Oil and wood, yes, but also something else. A thin, medicinal sweetness, absurdly out of place amid brass and walnut. Peter shut the door again, gently. "Chloral," he said, almost to himself. Sir Alaric, who had followed them down and now stood rigid at the edge of the group, went paler. Peter looked at him. "Sir Alaric," he said very softly, "are you quite certain you are the only person in this house who takes a sleeping draught?" No one answered. Even Parker, for once, did not speak. The clock went on ticking, as though time had no interest whatever in their embarrassment. And then, from somewhere deeper in the house, fainter than before, but unmistakable, came another single ring of a bell. 1. Peter did not move. He only smiled, thinly, as if the house itself had just made a correction. "There," he said quietly. "Our murderer is still conducting." Parker moved first, as though physical motion might keep the mind from forming pictures. "Where?" he demanded. Peter, however, did not answer at once. His head was slightly on one side, like a man enjoying a piece of music in which the melody has turned unexpectedly sinister. "Not the pantry bell," he said. "Not that one. This is lighter, more private." Sir Alaric made an impatient sound. "We have bells throughout the house. It could be any—" "It could," Peter agreed, "if it rang like a mistake. But it rings like a choice." He turned abruptly and walked, not toward the servants' quarters, not toward the chapel, but toward the East Range, where the domestic rooms lay with their comfortable fireplaces and their family portraits and their thick curtains designed to keep both draughts and truth at bay. Parker followed, grimly. Mrs. Harcourt followed too, her face oddly composed, as though she had ceased to be frightened and begun instead to be angry. They passed the morning room. The door stood shut. A faint line of light showed beneath it, although the afternoon was too grey to warrant lamps. Peter stopped. "There," he said softly. Parker seized the handle and flung the door open. The room beyond was lit, not brilliantly, but with that warm, concentrated glow of a shaded lamp. And the fire had been stirred up recently. It gave off a smell of fresh coal and hurried hands. The curtains were drawn, cutting off the Priory's damp daylight and making the room a private theatre. And in that theatre sat Mr. Albert Gedge. Not standing now with a butler's dignity, but perched on the edge of a chair, leaning over a small table with papers spread before him. One of his hands held a pencil. The other, half hidden, rested on the handle of a handbell. For an instant, nobody moved. Even Parker, accustomed to men caught in absurdity, paused because absurdity in the face of murder is never funny. Gedge looked up. His expression did not change much. It merely ceased pretending. "My lord," he said. Peter glanced at the bell, then at the papers. Then at the man's hand. Steady, clean, capable. You've been practicing, Peter observed mildly. The single ring, like a signature. Parker said harshly, "What are you doing in here? That's not your room." Gedge's gaze flicked to Mrs. Harcourt, and for the first time Peter saw in it something like appeal or accusation. "I was keeping things in order." Mrs. Harcourt's voice came out quiet and cutting. "In order for whom, Mr. Gedge?" Gedge swallowed. He did not look away, but his composure had begun to show fine cracks, like glaze on old porcelain. "For the house, my lady," he said. "For Sir Alaric. For everyone." Peter drifted into the room as though invited. He bent over the table, not touching, reading with his eyes the way he had read the chapel floor. The papers were not random. They were laid out with an almost scholarly neatness. Notes on the Priory's foundations, so copied in a firm hand. A rough plan of the chapel, and among them a small packet tied with tape. Old-fashioned, precisely as Bunter had described. Peter looked up. "Dr. Vale's notes," he said, conversationally. "You've been doing a little editing." Parker's hand went automatically toward his pocket, the place where handcuffs live like moral conclusions. Gedge said tightly, "They were in the wrong hands." "In whose hands were they?" Peter asked, "before they came into yours?" Gedge's jaw tightened. "His." "Yes," said Peter, "but before he died. Come now, Mr. Gedge. No geometry. Plain arithmetic. How did you get them?" Gedge's eyes flickered again, this time toward Sir Alaric, who stood in the doorway, pale as the saints in the stained glass. "I took them," Gedge said, and the admission came out with a kind of bitter relief, and as though he had been holding it in like a swallowed blade. After, Peter repeated. "After he was dead, which is a charming attempt to make yourself only a thief." Parker snapped, "Did you kill him?" Gedge's composure finally wavered, but not into hysteria, into something colder. "No," he said, "I did not kill him." "And yet," Peter said softly, "you have plaster on your shoes, a limp that matches our boot print, a bell you ring like a conductor, and the murdered man's papers spread out in a private room with the curtains drawn. One might suppose you are either very unlucky or very confident." Mrs. Harcourt took one step forward. "You've been ringing bells," she said, and now her anger made her voice ring more cleanly than brass. "Twice. Why?" Gedge looked at her fully. "Because," he said, "as I needed to know who was moving where. A bell is a way of making people show themselves. Servants come. Gentlefolk send servants. It's—" He stopped, and his mouth twisted. "It's how houses work." Peter's eyes narrowed with that quiet satisfaction which is not triumph but alignment, a pattern clicking into place. "Yes," he said. "Exactly. Houses are machines. And you, Mr. Gedge, understand the machine better than Sir Alaric does." Sir Alaric made a sound, half protest, half despair. "Gedge, what is the meaning of this?" Gedge's gaze did not go to him. When it did, it was with a bleak steadiness that made Sir Alaric look suddenly younger and weaker. "The meaning," Gedge said, "is that Dr. Vale was going to ruin you." Parker barked, "How?" Gedge's hand tightened on the pencil. He found it, the passage, the chamber, and more than that. He found what was hidden there years ago. He was going to publish. He was going to make a show of it. Lectures, papers, newspapers. Anglican Priory concealing Catholic relics, or whatever nonsense would sell. He didn't care what it did to the family. Sir Alaric's face had gone a strained grey. "There are no relics." Peter said almost gently, "Sir Alaric, not now. We have progressed beyond the comfort of denial." Parker moved to the table and peered down at the packet. "What's in there?" Gedge's voice turned sharp. "Don't touch that." Peter lifted a hand, not to stop Parker, but to calm him, like a man quieting a dog that has scented blood. Easy, Charles, he murmured. We are dealing with a butler, not a burglar. He will have arranged his evidence neatly. Parker glared but held back, by force of habit as much as deference to Peter's tone. Peter turned back to Gedge. All right, he said. You stole the papers. You rang bells to see who was listening. You have been in the Undercroft recently. But you say you did not kill Vale. Gedge met his gaze. I did not. Peter nodded slowly. Then you know who did. A silence fell. The fire crackled, absurdly domestic. Outside, the Priory's wet lawns and yew tree existed in their usual indifference. Gedge's throat worked. It wasn't meant, he began, and stopped. Peter's voice went quiet, and for once the irony in it was not protective. It was almost tender, which was worse. Not meant to, he said. That phrase is the confession of every murderer's accomplice. Mrs. Harcourt said very softly. Albert. The name, spoken without title, changed the room, and it made it suddenly intimate, dangerously so. Sir Alaric's head jerked up as though struck. Peter's eyes flicked between them and returned to Gedge with a kind of cold clarity. Ah, he said. There it is, the double life. Not occult, Charles, merely domestic. Love, loyalty, and the habit of ringing bells. Gedge's face tightened into something like despair. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, Peter said. I only haven't said it aloud yet. He turned his head slightly as though addressing not Gedge but the room itself. Charles, he said, I think we shall find that the geometry in the chapel was not meant to frighten the village at all. It was meant to frighten one person, the person who would recognize the message as a private joke and would therefore know that the murderer knew more than he ought. Parker said, On who? Peter's eyes rested very briefly on Sir Alaric Harcourt. Then he looked away again, as though refusing still to give away the end of the sentence. We shall see, he said softly. But first, Mr. Gedge will tell us what happened at 1:17. Gedge did not sit, but remained perched on the chair's edge as though the upholstery might accuse him. His eyes, fixed on the packet of notes, had the stubbornness of a man clinging to the one piece of order left him. 1:17, Parker repeated, with that grim police patience which suggests a willingness to wait all night for a syllable. Explain it. Gedge's mouth moved once, soundlessly. Then he said, It was the time the hall clock ought not to strike. Mrs. Harcourt's face altered, very slightly. Not comprehension exactly, but recognition, the look of a person hearing again a phrase once spoken in jest and now returned as an omen. Peter, standing by the hearth with his hands in his pockets and his head a little on one side, said, Go on. Gedge swallowed. Dr. Vale had a theory. He said your hall clock was wrong, not the 10 minutes fast, not that childish affectation, wrong in its mechanism, that it could be made to strike when it wasn't due. Parker barked a short laugh. Clocks don't strike by theory, they strike by gears. Yes, Peter murmured, and gears may be persuaded. Gedge shot him a look of unwilling gratitude, like a man grateful to find one intelligent person in the room and resentful that it should be this one. He'd been prowling, Gedge went on. Not just under the chapel, everywhere. He liked to... His lip curled. To know things. That he noticed the hall clock would sometimes hesitate before the hour, and sometimes run clean. He said it meant the weights were catching, or being caught. Sir Alaric made a hoarse sound. This is absurd. Peter turned his head slightly toward him. Not at all. A tall case clock is a most obliging creature. It keeps secrets in its belly. One may drop things into it. One may lift its hood and tamper. One may even, if one is theatrical, dose its interior with chloral so that the next person who bends close will smell it and begin thinking of sleeping draughts. Sir Alaric's face went rigid. Mrs. Harcourt did not look at him. She looked at the carpet. Parker snapped, Are you saying the clock was used to drug someone? I'm saying, Peter replied. "That someone wanted us to think about chloral. There is a difference. The murderer is always running a second narrative alongside the first, like a man humming over his own lies." Gedge's voice, low and harsh. Vale said that if the clock could be made to strike at 1:17, once, not the quarter chimes, it would be a signal, a private signal, a way of letting someone in the house know, without waking the whole place, that something was happening. Mrs. Harcourt's hand went to her throat. "He told you that?" "He told me," said Gedge, and for the first time his butler's composure broke into something nakedly human, because he thought it was amusing. He enjoyed making other people feel foolish. He stopped. His eyes flicked again to Sir Alaric, and what lay behind them was not simple hate, but a complicated, faithful contempt. Peter said, gently relentless, "Enjoyed what, Mr. Gedge? Being clever, or being dangerous?" Gedge's jaw tightened. "Both." Parker leaned in. "So 1:17 is a signal. Who was it a signal to?" Gedge's hand on the pencil clenched until the knuckles showed white. "To the person who knew the trick." "And who knew the trick?" Parker demanded. Gedge did not answer. Mrs. Harcourt said very softly, with dreadful clarity, "He meant it as a joke between men, between Dr. Vale and my husband." Sir Alaric's head lifted with a jerk. "Eleanor, don't," she said, and the word came out like a slap delivered with good manners. "Not that tone? Not now." Peter's gaze, which had hovered with detached interest over the whole room, narrowed at last upon Sir Alaric with the quiet focus of a lens. There was no accusation in it. That would have been too easy. There was only the terrible politeness of attention. "Sir Alaric," Peter said, "did Dr. Vale have occasion to examine your hall clock?" Sir Alaric's lips parted, closed, parted again. He mentioned it," he said at last. "He said it was out of true. He was always saying things were out of true." Peter nodded. "And did you discuss the notion of making it strike at an improper time?" Sir Alaric's composure cracked, not into confession, but into outrage, which is confession's cousin. "This is grotesque," he snapped. "You're all mad. I invited a scholar to my house, and now you suggest I ring clocks like a schoolboy." Peter said mildly, "Not ring. Signal." Parker's voice cut in like iron. "Vale's dead, Sir Alaric. Stop performing dignity and answer. Did you and Vale have a private signal? Yes or no?" Sir Alaric stared at Parker as though the policeman had committed an indecency in church. Mrs. Harcourt's voice came again, quieter than either man's, and therefore more powerful. "Alaric," she said, "if you don't speak now, you will be spoken for." Sir Alaric looked at her. Something in his face, pride, fear, and a particular English horror of being made to say the unsayable, wavered and then hardened. "No," he said. "There was no signal." Peter's eyebrows lifted. "Then 1:17, written twice, once on the dead man's watch and once in his own scribble, was meant for someone else." Gedge's voice came raw. "It was meant for me." Parker spun on him. "What?" Gedge's eyes shut briefly, as though he were bracing himself against a blow that had been falling all day. "Vale said," he forced out, "that if I ever heard the hall clock strike once at 1:17, it would mean he had found what he was looking for. Aye, that he'd opened the passage, that he'd be in the vault, and he swallowed. "I could come and see. Because I was the one who knew the house. He liked the idea of using me." Peter's voice went soft. "And did you hear it, Mr. Gedge?" Gedge opened his eyes. "No?" A pause. "Mrs. Harcourt said very slowly, but I heard 1 o'clock. "Yes," Peter murmured. "And someone placed a watch at 1:17, as though correcting your memory, nudging it just slightly toward a different sound." Parker stared at Peter. "You think she didn't hear the clock? You think she heard something else?" "I think," said Peter, that the human ear in the night is a gullible witness. A single click can become a chime. A footstep can become a conscience. And a woman who is meant to remember a clock will remember a clock, because remembering a clock is respectable. Sir Alaric's voice strained. What are you implying? Peter looked at him, and his tone became lightly conversational again, more dangerous than anger. I imply, he said, that the murder was committed by someone who understands this house as Mr. Gedge does. Its passages, its mufflings, its bells, its clocks, and its people. Someone who could move where he pleased, leave a door unlatched, ring a bell once, and make the right person go where he wished. Parker's face darkened. So Gedge is lying about being in the morning room and holding Vale's notes. What's that? If he didn't kill him. Gedge's voice was thick. Cleaning. Peter's head tilted. Cleaning what? Gedge's eyes went to Mrs. Harcourt again, too quickly and too helplessly, and back to Peter as though asking him not to make the next thing inevitable. Cleaning up, he said hoarsely, after someone who panicked. Mrs. Harcourt's composure finally broke, not into sobs, she was not the sobbing kind, but into a small, sharp laugh without humor. Panicked, she repeated. Yes, that is what we do in this house, isn't it? We panic and then we tidy. Peter said quietly, Tell me, Mrs. Harcourt, when you woke at 1, did you get out of bed? Her eyes met his, and in them was a flash of stubborn honesty. Yes, she said. I did. Parker stepped forward. Where did you go? Eleanor's lips tightened. To the corridor, toward the cloister. Sir Alaric said, violently controlled. Why? Because, she said, and her voice was now very steady. I thought I heard something that wasn't the clock. Peter nodded slowly, as though something inside him had settled into place. A door, he said. A click. Mrs. Harcourt did not answer. She did not need to. Peter turned to Parker, and for the first time all day he sounded almost brisk. Charles, he said, we shall have to do what murderers hate most. What's that? Parker demanded. Peter's smile was thin as a knife. Reconstruct the night, he said, with distances, doors, and timings. In this house, it appears, one can make truth ring once and be heard as something else entirely. Parker borrowed Sir Alaric's study as headquarters, because an English murder investigation, like an English dinner party, proceeds best when everyone is made faintly uncomfortable and no one is allowed quite enough room. The room itself was a monument to controlled taste. Blotter square to the desk edge, pens aligned like obedient soldiers, a row of devotional books standing a little apart from the novels, as though even on a shelf Sir Alaric wished to keep temptation under supervision. Peter had insisted, quietly, persistently, that they reconstruct the night without drama. That meant not feelings, not motives, not the agreeable Victorian pastime of guessing at wickedness, but doors, distances, latches, hinges, and the time it takes a human being to move through stone corridors in stockings. Right, said Parker, setting his watch on the desk as if pinning time down by the scruff. We start at midnight. Everyone in their rooms by then? Sir Alaric said stiffly. Yes. Mrs. Harcourt's expression did not alter, but she said nothing, which, Peter noted, so was not agreement, but a refusal to lend her voice to her husband's narrative. Gedge sat apart, hands folded, the posture of a man who has spent his life arranging other people's lives and is now discovering the inconvenience of his own. Bunter stood behind Peter with the unobtrusive stillness of a shadow that had learned to think. Peter said, We will not begin at midnight. Midnight is a literary hour, and nearly always untrue. We begin at the last certain thing. Parker glared. All right, last certain thing. Dinner, said Peter. Tell me, Mrs. Harcourt, what did Dr. Vale do after dinner? Eleanor answered at once. and the speed of it suggested she had been turning the scene over in her head with a kind of punishment. He talked about the old Priory and its Catholic bones, and laughed at Alaric when he said it was fanciful. And he drank port. He asked Mr. Gedge for the hall clock key. Sir Alaric's head jerked up. It's true, Eleanor said with quiet ferocity. He did. Parker's pencil scraped. Clock key. Did you give it him, Gedge? Gedge's voice was flat. Yes, Inspector. Peter looked at him. You did it because you were ordered, or because you were curious? Gedge's jaw tightened. Both. Excellent, said Peter. Curiosity is the only vice the English truly forgive, provided it is well dressed. Parker said sharply. What did Vale do with the key? Gedge hesitated a fraction too long. He opened the clock case, looked inside, talked about weights catching. He said... The words came out with reluctant exactness. He said he could make it strike once at a time of his choosing, if he wished. Sir Alaric's face had the bleak indignation of a man forced to hear his own house described as a toy. Boastful nonsense. Peter's tone stayed mild. Nonsense has a habit of becoming practical when repeated often enough. Parker leaned forward. Did Vale do anything else with the clock? Gedge said. He closed it, gave the key back. Peter said, and then? Eleanor. He went up to his room at about 10. Sir Alaric. At 10:30. Peter held up a hand. We must not fight over half hours. Half hours are the refuge of imprecise consciences. Let us say between 10 and 10:30. Parker's face tightened. And you, Sir Alaric? Sir Alaric. I retired at 11. I took my draft. I slept. Peter. Who prepares your draft? Sir Alaric's mouth hardened. I do. Peter nodded. So nobody can swear you were asleep except the chloral and your good opinion of yourself. Sir Alaric flushed. Parker turned to Eleanor. You went up at 11. Yes, she said, and I lay awake. The house was noisy. Peter's eyebrows lifted. Noisy how? Eleanor hesitated, then, as if tired of being polite about her own fear, spoke with blunt precision. The wind in the cloister, a door somewhere that did not settle, and, at 1, something like the hall clock. Peter said, and you got up? Yes. Parker. Describe exactly. Eleanor drew a breath. I went into the corridor. I did not light the lamp. I walked toward the cloister passage. Her voice tightened. I heard a click, like a door pulled to properly. Then I heard soft footsteps, as though someone were careful. Peter said softly, Toward you or away? Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Away, toward the chapel. Parker, did you see anyone? No. Peter, did you smell anything? That startled her. She opened her eyes. Smell? Yes, said Peter. People forget they have noses until tragedy lends them one. Eleanor's gaze drifted, and for the first time she looked not angry, but faintly sick. A sweet smell, she said slowly, like medicine, not perfume, not soap. Peter murmured, chloral again. Our murderer is either dosing someone or planting the notion of dosing. Parker snapped, Then what did you do? Eleanor's fingers tightened on the chair arm. I went back. I told myself it was nothing. I listened until I heard nothing. Peter said almost gently, And you did not wake your husband. No, she said, and the word was both confession and accusation. No, Sir Alaric said sharply, because there was no reason. Eleanor turned her head a fraction. Because there was no point. That silence, heavy and intimate, told Parker more about the house than any diagram. He cleared his throat as though to force the air back into official channels. All right, he said. Now, Gedge. 1:30 to 2. Your movements. Gedge's mouth tightened. In my room. Peter's voice was conversational. With the clock key returned and Dr. Vale upstairs with his notes and a secret passage newly unbricked. You must forgive us if we suspect your room was not very entertaining." Gedge's composure cracked into a brief spasm of bitterness. "I told you, I did not kill him," Peter said quietly. "No, but you were there when something happened. The dust on your shoes says so. And you rang the bell twice today because you were trying to find out who else knows you were there." Gedge stared at the table. "You make it sound neat." "Murder always begins neatly," said Peter. "It ends badly." Parker leaned in hard. "Did Vale come to you in the night? Did he summon you?" Gedge's throat worked. "No." "Peter, then you went to him?" Gedge's eyes shut again. "Yes." Parker, "Why?" Gedge's voice came out low. "Because he left a message." Peter, "Where?" Gedge, "In the pantry, under the silver drawer, a scrap. He'd been doing it, leaving little scraps, like he owned the house." Peter's gaze sharpened. "And what did the scrap say?" Gedge's mouth twisted. 1:17. Peter nodded, very slowly. "A cue, not struck by a clock at all, but written to make you think of it. He wanted you moving at 1:17, so that if anything went wrong, your footsteps would be part of the story." Parker sat back a fraction, the first sign that the thing had ceased to be merely a murder and had become a mechanism. "You went down," Parker said. "To the vault." "Yes," Gedge whispered. "And you found him dead," Parker said. Gedge did not answer immediately. "When he did, it was with the hopeless care of a man choosing words that will ruin him." "I found him," he said, "not dead. Not yet." Eleanor's breath caught. Sir Alaric made a small, strangled sound. Peter did not move, but the room felt suddenly colder, as though the Priory stones had leaned in. "Go on," Peter said. Gedge's voice was hoarse. "He was on the floor, in the chamber, dazed. Someone had hurt him. He couldn't speak properly. He swallowed. "I thought it was Sir Alaric." Sir Alaric's head came up, furious. "How dare you?" Peter's voice cut across him, soft and deadly. "Sir Alaric, sit down. You may resume your dignity later, if it survives." Sir Alaric didn't sit, but he fell silent, which, for him, was almost as great a humiliation. Parker said, "Why did you think it was Sir Alaric?" Gedge's eyes flicked once toward Eleanor. "Because Dr. Vale said, weeks ago, that Sir Alaric was afraid of what lay under the chapel, and because I heard a man's voice down there, a man I thought I knew." Peter's eyes narrowed. "Thought you knew?" Gedge nodded, miserably. "It was muffled. The passage twists. The stone eats words." Peter murmured. "Acoustics again. The chapel swallows screams. The undercroft swallows identities." Parker's pencil snapped. "Who was it? Then?" Gedge's hands clenched. "I don't know." Peter's voice was very quiet now. "Yes, you do. You simply cannot say it without destroying the last thing you have been protecting." He looked not at Gedge, but at Eleanor Harcourt. "Mrs. Harcourt," he said, "when you smelled that sweet medicinal scent in the corridor, you were meant to think of your husband's draft. You were meant to think, Alaric is asleep, therefore Alaric is innocent." Eleanor's face went utterly still. Peter continued almost lazily, as though discussing curtains. "But chloral can be used in two ways," he said, "to make a man sleep, or to make a woman believe he must be sleeping." Parker stared at him. "Peter, are you saying the draft was staged?" "I am saying," Peter replied, "that someone in this house is expert at staging, bells, clocks, doors, geometry, and the person who benefits most from Sir Alaric being safely, publicly asleep is Sir Alaric himself." Sir Alaric's voice burst out, high and outraged. "This is outrageous!" Peter turned his head, and the air changed. The wit remained, but it was now the wit of a man who has reached the end of patience and keeps politeness only because it is sharper than shouting. "Outrageous," he said softly, "is arranging a dead man like a diagram in a chapel. Compared with that, Sir Alaric, my suspicions are positively conventional." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "Charles," he said at last, "there is only one way to settle this. We must test the clock, and we must test the house. Tonight." Parker's eyes narrowed. "A reenactment. A very small one," said Peter, "with no corpse, if possible, but with doors clicking, bells ringing once, and with a man who limps attempting to move through passages he insists do not exist." Gedge's head jerked up. "You can't." Peter smiled thinly. "I can. Murderers hate experiments. Experiments make lies repeat themselves, and lies are seldom as consistent as murderers imagine." He looked around the room, and the Priory, in its respectable silence, seemed suddenly less like a house and more like a trap built out of manners. "After all," Peter added softly, "geometry is only comforting when the lines stay where you put them." After dinner, the house performed its accustomed small rites of withdrawal, and because those rites had been practiced for years, they felt deceptively like safety. Lamps were lowered. Doors were pulled to with that careful finality which is meant to keep draughts out and propriety in. Somewhere, a maid set down a poker, and somewhere else, a man's step paused and resumed with the faint unevenness Peter had already noticed in dust. Peter and Parker waited, as Peter insisted, not in the chapel, too theatrical, and not in Sir Alaric's study, too honest, but in the cloister passage where sound had room to misbehave. Parker had men placed at practical points: west door, servants' stair, hall, vault access, each with orders to keep his feet still and his mouth shut. Peter had Bunter placed where Bunter could see without being seen, which was, in effect, everywhere. "Remember," Peter said quietly, "we are not hunting a phantom, we are persuading a habit to repeat itself." Parker muttered, "If it repeats itself, I'll arrest it." "That," said Peter, "and is your touching faith in human consistency." They had set the hall clock to correctness. No 10 minutes fast indulgence tonight. Its face stood in the dark like a pale conscience. Sir Alaric had objected, of course, but Parker had told him that the police were not a decorative feature, and the clock was adjusted with an efficiency that would have wounded any ancestor present. Mrs. Harcourt had refused to go to bed. She sat in the morning room with the lamp shaded low, hands folded, listening as though her life depended on distinguishing one click from another. Gedge had been confined, politely but firmly, under the supervision of a constable in the pantry. Sir Alaric retreated to his room with the air of a man who believes that innocence ought to protect him like a blanket. At 1 o'clock the hall clock struck, and the sound went out cleanly and died against the stone. Peter watched Mrs. Harcourt, though she was 2 corridors away. He watched by imagining her, which for him was often enough. He himself did not stir. 1 o'clock was not their hour. 1:17, Parker whispered. "Yes," said Peter. 1:17 is a cue for a person who believes himself clever. It makes him feel he is following rules. They waited. The Priory, which by day had looked theatrically medieval, by night behaved like any old house. It creaked, it sighed, it settled. But beneath those ordinary noises there was another layer, minute, purposeful. A faint scrape, like a boot turning carefully on grit. A pause. Then the soft, domestic sound of a door being pulled in until it clicked. Peter's head lifted slightly. Parker, rigid, mouthed, "Where?" Peter did not answer, as he moved. He went not toward the chapel, but toward the corridor that led by a short cut to the little linen anteroom where they had found the handbell. He moved with the peculiar confidence of a man walking in a darkness he has already mapped. Parker followed, furious at being made to follow, and therefore convinced he was right too. At the corner, Peter stopped and put out a hand, not to open a door, but to steady himself on the wall for the briefest moment, like a man remembering pain. It was a tiny piece of acting. Done well enough, it would have passed unnoticed. Done in this house, on this night, it was a flare. Parker stared at him. Peter smiled without humor. If our ghost limps, Charles, we should limp too. It encourages him. They rounded the last turn. The linen room door was ajar by the width of a respectable secret. The lamplight, small, warm, leaked out. Parker stepped forward and flung it open. The room was empty. But it was empty in the way a stage is empty after the actor has slipped off into the wings. Objects were in motion's wake. The chair had been pulled back hard enough to leave a faint gouge on the boards. The handbell lay on its side, still trembling faintly, as though it had been wrung and dropped. On the table, beside the ledger, was a small glass. No longer warm, but with a thin film at the bottom, smelling sweetly medicinal. Peter did not touch it. He bent his head and inhaled. "Chloral," he said softly. Parker's voice was a whisper now, as if the house might overhear. "Who brought that here?" Peter's eyes went to the floor. There, on the boards by the threshold, were pale smears, plaster, chalk dust, fresh as confession. They led out, not toward the hall, but toward the cloister passage and the concealed route down. "He's gone back under," Parker said. Peter shook his head. "Not he. Someone. Don't give the house the luxury of a single villain yet." They moved quickly then, Parker with his lantern, Peter with his patience. Down the service stair, into the vault, past the bricked arch, now gaping like an extracted tooth. The air that breathed out of the hidden passage was colder than before, as though disturbed by the return of its owner. In the small chamber at the passage end, Parker's men were already there, one crouched by the rope, another standing at the hollow-sounding wall. Their faces had the strained look of men told to expect a ghost and finding instead only damp stone. "No one came through," one whispered. "As we'd have heard." Peter's gaze went past them to the soot-dark wall where the scratched triangle had been. It was still there. But beside it, newly scratched, was a single word, done with a quick, hard point, the letters uneven but legible. Eleanor Mrs. Harcourt's name. Parker went very still. Bloody hell! Peter did not react at once. His face had the remote composure of a man watching a chess problem solve itself into something ugly. "This," he said softly, "is what the geometry was for, not village superstition, blackmail." Parker turned on him. "So you were right. It's meant to frighten one person." "Yes," said Peter, "and to force one person to move, at 1:17, into a corridor where she will smell chloral and think of her husband's draft and tell herself he is asleep, therefore safe, out of therefore innocent." Parker's jaw clenched. "And meanwhile, someone scratches her name under the chapel like a threat." Peter nodded once. "Or like an accusation. You know?" Bunter, appearing soundlessly behind them as if he had been conjured, spoke for the first time in several minutes. "My lord, Inspector, if I may, Mr. Gedge's constable has left his post." Parker spun. "What?" Bunter's voice did not change. "The pantry is empty. So is the servants' passage. There are footsteps, fresh dust leading toward the hall." Parker cursed under his breath and started back. Peter caught his sleeve, not to restrain him, but to redirect. "Charles," he said quietly, "don't run to where he wants you. Think like a man who rings bells." Parker froze, furious at the logic of it. Peter continued, calm as a surgeon. "Where do you go in this house if you must be seen to go somewhere innocent while doing something else entirely?" Parker's eyes widened. "The chapel." "Exactly," said Peter, "because nothing looks so respectable as a man going to pray after horror." They ran then, down the passage, up the stair, through the cloister corridor where the yew tree's shadow lay like ink. The chapel door stood open. Inside, the dark held its breath. Parker's lantern cut through it and found, not Gedge, but Sir Alaric Harcourt, standing rigid before the altar rail. In his hand was the broken silver crucifix from the morning's diagram. He was holding it as though it could absolve him by contact. He looked round at them, and for the first time his cultivated dignity had dropped away, showing something smaller and more frightened underneath. "She's—" he began. Some, and his voice broke. "Where is Eleanor?" Peter's gaze went past him, down to the floor. A new arrangement had been started. The stones moved, not yet symmetrical. The compass shifted. The pocket watch placed again at 1:17, its cracked face turned upward like an eye. It was an unfinished sentence. Peter spoke very gently. "Sir Alaric, who told you to come here?" Sir Alaric's mouth worked. "I heard the bell." "Once." Parker stared. "You heard it from your room?" "Yes," Sir Alaric whispered. "And then I smelled chloral in the corridor. I thought—" His eyes darted wildly. "I thought someone had tampered with my draft. I thought, God help me, I thought Eleanor had—" Peter's voice remained soft, but it had become iron beneath velvet. "Someone is playing your marriage," he said, as though it were a set of bells. Parker snapped. "Where's Gedge?" Sir Alaric gave a tiny, helpless shake of the head. Peter looked down at the half-made geometry, and the faintest of smiles touched his mouth. Wry, weary, almost sad. "Mr. Gedge," he said, "has finally decided to stop tidying and start acting." He turned to Parker. "Charles," he said, "get men to the morning room and Mrs. Harcourt's corridor. Now. The Undercroft message was written to drive us here. Mrs. Harcourt is the real destination." Parker was already moving. Peter remained one moment longer, looking at the broken crucifix in Sir Alaric's hand. "Sir Alaric," he said quietly, "a man was killed to keep a secret. But secrets rarely stay buried. They only change their shape." Sir Alaric whispered, "What secret?" Peter's eyes lifted to the stained-glass saints, dim and accusing. "The one," he said, "that makes a respectable house ring like a trap." Then he turned and went out, and the chapel, emptying behind him, held its dim, chilly silence, with the half-finished pattern on the floor like a thought one is ashamed to complete.